Okay, so let me give you an example here. In our moment in time, so the year 2012, I almost said 2010, what is the base, or what is the system of relations, of productive relations, and who owns the means of production? Well, and generally, in our country, and certainly kind of creeping across the face of the globe, our economic system is free market, financialized, low barrier capitalism. So what are some aspects of that? Well, in this advanced stage of the capitalist system, markets kind of go everywhere. They infiltrate all various aspects of the world and society. Markets cause financial panics like we've had in the last couple of years. Free market capitalism can cause difficulty for workers who feel like they have become just a unit that has to try and sell themselves at the lowest possible price in order just to get employment, and they're competing against people they don't even know in other countries across the world. Markets can produce great inequality, and they can concentrate great power. These are all sorts of things that have marked our life today. He'd be pointing out that these are some of the aspects of the base at this moment in history. Okay, so right about now you're probably saying to yourself, well, where does culture come in? Where does this topic of our course come in? Well, Marx's fascinating idea was that this base caused culture. And he kind of had a couple words that we'll use to think about culture. And he called, one of those words that he had for calling or talking about culture was superstructure. I know these sounds like terms out of a Star Wars movie or something now, but these are the English translations of his terms. And Marx's idea was that what occurred in the base led to this superstructure. And now let me say more about what the superstructure thing is. The superstructure is the system of institutions and ideas that develop from the dominating mode of production, from the base of a given historical moment in time. And in Marx's vision, the superstructure was primarily a force of ideology. And in the Marx is one of the early users of that term, a term that's kind of become familiar to us in political talk and things. But Marx used the phrase ideology in a pejorative sense to say ideology is a false reading, a false description, a false analysis of what is actually happening in the base, in this place of where the economic forces of society are. And his idea was that the different, or whatever was going on at the base at a particular historical moment caused particular forms of the superstructure, or particular forms of ideology, which covered over the base. Now, let me insert a slide here. I'm going to show you a couple of quotations that I'm going to read off, so I'll insert the slide right here. Marx's description of superstructure, ideology, what we call culture, was that culture was primarily epiphenomenal. It was driven by something else. So culture, unlike Hegel, where culture is kind of this spirit, this Geist, it's floating around, and that causes history, that causes the economy and politics. Marx's argument was, no, it's the opposite of that. It's the actual relations of production and economics that causes the superstructure to develop. And the particular ideas and institutions that develop in the superstructure create ideology, which has this effect of kind of hiding the base. The purpose of ideology in Marx's argument was to kind of disguise what's actually happening in the economy from people, producing, and this is a famous word for Marx, producing false consciousness. So his argument is that those with power in the economic process help to create the system of ideology that shields the knowledge about what's actually happening at the root of society, shields us as workers, as people who are involved in the relations of production, from actually knowing what's going on in our world and what's going on in our lives. As the slide said, Marx argued that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e., the class, which is the ruling material force of society, is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. And then another quote I have on that slide. Ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships. So the ruling ideas, ideology, is nothing more in Marx's sense than an expression of what's actually going down at the base. And importantly, it's an expression that hides what's going down on the base. Marx looked to certain things to find culture, to find where this ideology was happening. So he would look at law, so books of British common law. He'd go to the British Library and read law and say, well, some people think law popped into people's head and then we made an economic system. Marx said, no, that's not the case at all. Instead, there's the capitalist mode of production exploded on the scene in Europe in the 1800s, and it was able to change the shape of law and convince us of this idea of private property, which actually covers over the fact that private property is highly unequal and highly kind of congealed into sources of power and not equally distributed. So Marx had all these examples of where he would look at art, for example, or he might even look at the institution of marriage, and he'd say, marriage looks the way it does in the year 1850 not because we have some great ideas about what love is and how human companionship and family should be, no, but because there are particular ways that the economy is working at this point in historical time. His description of this relationship between base and superstructure has come to be known as the reflection theory of culture. And what we mean by this, it's just off the corner here, let me slide it over here. What we mean by here is that Marx is like literally arguing that the superstructure, those ideas and institutions that become the ideology that covers over the base, this superstructure is a reflection of the base, but it's a perverted reflection of the base. And that brings us back to this idea of the camera obscura. And I'll insert a slide right here. And you can see that what that slide shows is Marx's argument that the reality is that the base is driving the superstructure. But what ideology does to us, the power of culture, is it flips that relationship. And it makes us think, like Hegel, that instead it's the ideas and the spirit of the times that's creating history, that's creating economic system. And one of Marx's big project was to try and always point out that we have to be aware that this camera obscura is operating in the social world around us, and that what we think we're seeing, or he would argue what law in his day or intellectuals in his day or even marriage in his day was about covering over and disguising the true relation of what drives things, or the true force of history. And so he's saying what we're looking at in ideas and institutions in culture we think is a picture, but if we're aware that we're looking at a camera obscura, we realize the reality is the opposite of what we're looking at. So let me give you some examples here. For example, so Marx would argue that as we have different moments of the base, so this is my symbol for base, we'll have different forms of culture. So for example, in medieval times, and I'll put that with a big M, we have land control through the hierarchical relations of lords and serfs and feudalism. And Marx would argue, well, it's not much surprise then that we developed this snazzy cultural idea of the great chain of being. You may have heard of this. So if the mode of relation, the base, is characterized by hierarchy, it's not much surprise that the thinking, philosophical thinking of that time had this conception of the kingdom of God as this chain of being with the lowliest, poorest on the bottom, but they were somehow inevitably connected with God at the top as long as they realized the divine authority of all the rulers between them and the source of the divine. So Marx would say, see, this is the culture, the superstructure that develops from that, and that idea in itself, chain of being, sanctifies and mystifies the actual modes of relation, which are unjust for the majority of people who are caught in the system of feudalism. Or, and I've already suggested this example a little bit, he would say, you know, in capitalist times, say in the 19th century, we have a mode of relation which is premised on private property and massive holdings of capital. And he would say, well, that's kind of interesting that in this epoch we have the development of this idea of private property. We have this development of the idea of individualism. And we have all sorts of institutions like law and churches and things like that that kind of pump out these ideas or reproduce these ideas. And his argument is, again, like, well, that superstructure matches the base. It's come from the base. It reflects the base, and that's an important word in this, reflection. And in the end, it sanctifies and kind of mystifies the actual base, the actual mode of productive relations that's occurring at that point in time. Let me, oops, hold on one second. The point then overall for Marx is that culture is not this autonomous force whereby intellectuals and artists and leaders are kind of having deep reflection into the nature of reality and describing it for us. Marx says to really know the nature of reality, you must look at the mode of productions, the base, and what's going on there. And then, and only then, can you understand the superstructure, the ideas and institutions of an epoch, which, importantly for Marx, keep the system in place and prevent people from realizing the own unjustness of the system. So let me pause right there. Now, there's a lot of provocative stuff in what I've said, and of course, you know, a lot of Marxist economic theory has been shown to be wrong or highly problematic, if you will. But actually, there's some very interesting things in this argument that I'm going to come back after the break here and give some examples, including examples from a reading as to what's going on.